The boundary between universes is not distance, it is resonance. You're standing at the edge of something that has no edge, listening for a sound that never stops, preparing to step into a journey that requires no movement at all. What you're about to experience is not a story with a beginning and an end, but a slow unfolding of attention across possibilities that exist simultaneously, layered over one another like sheets of glass so thin they become invisible. This is not meant to be solved, it is meant to be felt. The multiverse does not announce itself with fanfare or spectacle. It hums, it vibrates, it waits beneath everything you know, patient and inexhaustible, offering infinite variations on a single theme. What could have been, what might still be, what exists in the spaces between your thoughts when you stop trying to hold them. The void is not empty. This is the first truth, and it is the hardest one to accept because we have been taught to think of nothingness as the absence of something, a blank slate, a silence that waits to be filled. But the void is alive, it breathes, it pulses with potential. Imagine standing in a room where no sound has been made yet, but the air is so thick with possibility that you can feel the weight of every note that could ever be played pressing against your skin. That is the void. It is not what remains when everything is taken away. It is what exists before anything chooses to become. Scientists call it the quantum field, philosophers call it the ground of being, mystics call it the source. But the name does not matter because the experience is always the same, a sensation of fullness that has not yet declared itself, a readiness that never exhausts itself, a field of pure potential humming at a frequency so low and so constant that you have learned to ignore it the way you ignore your own heartbeat. But it is there. It has always been there. And if you stop, if you truly stop and listen beneath the noise of your thoughts and the chatter of your senses, you will hear it, a foundational vibration that underlies everything, the quiet engine of all that could happen. This baseline hum is not singular. That is the second truth. If one baseline can exist, then slightly different baselines can also exist, each one creating its own universe, its own set of rules, its own unfolding of time and matter and meaning. Think of it like this. A single note played on a piano creates a tone, but that tone is not alone. It carries with it overtones, harmonics, sympathetic vibrations in other strings that were not struck but respond anyway, because they share a relationship with the original note. The multiverse is built this way. One reality vibrates, and in responding to its own existence it calls into being 1,000 others, each one a harmonic variation, each one slightly out of phase, each one real in its own right. You cannot see them because they do not occupy space in the way you understand space. They occupy possibility. They exist in the same location as you, overlapping perfectly, separated only by the fact that they resonate at a different frequency. And frequency, not distance, is the true measure of separation. A universe where you chose to stay instead of leave is not far away. It is right here, vibrating at a pitch your senses cannot detect, close enough to touch if you knew how to reach. Every version of you is a frequency. This is where the personal begins to emerge from the cosmic, where the grand architecture of infinite realities narrows down to something intimate and immediate. The question of who you are and who you might have been, and how those two ideas are not as separate as they seem. In one universe you woke up early today, in another you stayed in bed, in another still you never went to sleep at all because last night you made a different choice, and that choice led to another choice, and now the entire shape of your life has bent into a form you would not recognize. These are not fantasies, they are frequencies. Each one is a version of you defined by small differences, tiny shifts in cause and effect that ripple outward until they become entire identities. Some of these versions feel close. If you quiet your mind and let your imagination drift, you can almost sense them. The person you would have been if you had said yes instead of no, if you had turned left instead of right, if you had taken the risk or played it safe or stayed silent or spoken up. These versions hum at frequencies so near to your own that they create a kind of resonance, a sympathetic vibration that makes them feel more real, more possible, more like they could have been you if the circumstances had aligned just slightly differently. Other versions feel distant, alien, unrecognizable. These are the frequencies that diverged long ago, shaped by choices so fundamental that they altered the entire trajectory of your existence. In one universe, you were born in a different country. In another, you never met the person who changed your life. In another, a single moment of chance, an accident avoided, an opportunity missed, a word spoken or left unsaid, sent everything cascading in a direction so foreign that the you who lives there would not even understand the you who is here now. These distant frequencies do not resonate. They hum at pitches so different from your own that they might as well be different songs entirely. And yet they are still you. They are still branches of the same tree, expressions of the same underlying pattern, proof that identity is not fixed but fluid, not a single note, but a chord made up of countless harmonics, each one valid, each one real, each one living out its own version of what it means to be. Which frequency feels most like home? This is not an idle question. It is an invitation to notice something subtle, something you might have felt before but never named. The sense that some possible versions of yourself feel more true than others, that some alternate paths feel like they were meant to happen even though they did not, that some choices feel like they are still vibrating in the back of your mind, waiting for you to return to them, to pick them up, to see what might have unfolded if you had only reached for them when you had the chance. Resonance is a form of recognition. It is your mind intuitively sensing a version of itself that could have been, a frequency close enough to your own that the two begin to overlap, to blur, to harmonize. And in that moment of resonance, the boundary between what is and what might have been becomes so thin that you can almost step through it. You can almost feel what it would be like to live in that other reality, to be that other self, to know what they know and feel what they feel, and carry the weight of choices you did not make, but that still, somehow, belong to you. The drift begins gently. There is no announcement, no marker that says you are leaving one reality and entering another. The multiverse is not a building with rooms and doors and hallways. It is a spectrum, a continuum, a smooth gradient of possibility where each point flows seamlessly into the next. Nearby possibilities differ by millimeters. A conversation that took 30 seconds instead of 29, a glance held for one heartbeat longer, a thought that flickered and faded instead of taking root. These micro-variations are so subtle that you would not notice them if you lived them. They feel identical to your current reality because they are nearly identical, separated only by the thinnest of margins, the quietest of shifts. But as you move further along the spectrum, the differences accumulate. What began as a slight change in timing becomes a moderate change in circumstance, becomes a radical change in outcome. Far possibilities differ by entire histories. Wars that never happened, technologies that were never invented, people who were never born, civilizations that rose in places where deserts exist in your world, languages that sound like music because they evolved from singing instead of speaking. The further you drift, the stranger it becomes, but the transition is always smooth. There are no hard edges in the multiverse, no walls or barriers or lines that cannot be crossed. There is only the gentle reblending of cause and effect, the slow morphing of one configuration of reality into another, like a landscape seen from a moving train, where the mountains in the distance gradually become hills, become flatlands, become ocean, without ever requiring you to stop and acknowledge the change. Allow your thoughts to wander. This is not a directive, but a permission, an acknowledgement that the mind does not move in straight lines and that trying to force it to follow a rigid path defeats the purpose of what you are doing here. If you lose the thread, that is not failure. That is participation. Drifting is the mechanism of travel in a multiverse built on resonance, and the mind drifts naturally when it is given space to do so. A thought arises. What if I had stayed? What if I had gone? What if I had spoken up, reached out, held on, let go? The thought does not demand an answer. It simply hovers, shimmering, inviting you to consider it without needing to resolve it. And in considering it, you begin to feel the edges of another reality, another frequency, another version of yourself that made the opposite choice and lived to see where it led. You do not need to see this other life in vivid detail. You do not need to construct a narrative or build a backstory, or imagine every consequence that followed from that single divergent moment. You only need to feel it, to sense its presence the way you sense a room even when your eyes are closed, to let it brush against your awareness like a melody heard from a distance, familiar but indistinct, real but unreachable. The immersive quality of this drift is not accidental. It is built into the structure of the multiverse itself, a natural consequence of the fact that realities are not isolated but overlapping, not separate but interpenetrating, not distant but stacked so closely together that they create a kind of density, a richness, a depth that can be felt even if it cannot be seen. If you imagine the multiverse as a sound, it would not be a single tone but a chord made of infinite notes, each one blending into the others to create something fuller and more complex than any individual note could achieve on its own. And if you are sensitive to this chord, if you can tune your awareness to the right frequency, you begin to notice that the boundaries between notes are not as clear as you thought. One note bleeds into the next, and the next, and the next, until the entire chord becomes a wash of sound that surrounds you, holds you, encloses you in something that feels both infinite and intimate. This is not a gimmick. This is the architecture of experience when you stop insisting that reality must be singular, linear, discrete. The mind is capable of perceiving more than one thing at once. It does it all the time, holding a memory while living in the present, imagining a future while processing the past, feeling multiple emotions simultaneously without needing to choose which one is the truest. The multiverse simply extends this capacity outward, asking you to hold multiple possibilities in your awareness at once, and to notice how they interact, how they resonate, how they shape each other, even when they never touch. If you lose the thread, that is part of the experience. This bears repeating because the urge to grasp, to hold on, to maintain control is so deeply ingrained that it will reassert itself again and again as you move through this space. You will find yourself trying to remember where you started, trying to trace the path from here back to there, trying to construct a map of the journey so that you do not get lost. But there is no map. There is only the drift, and the drift does not require memory or effort or vigilance. It requires release. It requires trust. It requires the willingness to let go of the idea that you must always know where you are and how you got there, and to accept instead that you are everywhere and nowhere, here and not here, present in all versions of yourself simultaneously, because presence is not a location but a state of being, and being is not confined to a single frequency. If you fall asleep during this, that is not a failure either. Sleep is its own form of drifting, its own way of accessing the spectrum of possibilities that the waking mind is too rigid to perceive. Dreams are the closest thing most people ever experience to genuine multiverse travel. Unmoored from the constraints of linear time, free to blend memories and futures and things that never happened into a single fluid narrative that makes no sense when you wake, but feels utterly real while you're inside it. So if the drift carries you into sleep, let it. You're still travelling. You're still moving through the spectrum. You're still exploring realities that exist alongside your own, only now you're doing it in the language of dreams instead of the language of waking thought, and there is no difference between the two except the one you insist on maintaining. The multiverse does not care whether you believe in it. It exists regardless, humming its infinite chord, offering its endless variations, waiting with the patience of something that has no concept of time because it contains all times, all moments, all possibilities unfolding at once in a simultaneity that the human mind can only glimpse in fragments. You do not need to understand it. You do not need to prove it. You only need to stop resisting it, to stop insisting that the reality you perceive is the only reality there is, and to allow yourself to feel the presence of others pressing against the edges of your awareness like waves lapping at the shore. Each wave is a possibility. Each wave is a version. Each wave is real. And you are standing at the shore, not separate from the waves, but part of them, made of the same water, moved by the same tides, connected to the entire ocean even when you feel like a single drop. The echoes are returning now, slowly, gently, like a tide that has reached its furthest point and begins to pull back toward the centre, from many realities to fewer, from many selves to one quiet witness, from many ideas back to the baseline truth of potential. This is not a collapse but a resolution, a harmonizing, a return to the foundational hum that started everything. All those distant frequencies are still there, still vibrating, still real, but they are no longer competing for your attention. They are settling back into the background, fading not into silence, but into the kind of quiet that holds everything without needing to announce it. You're becoming aware again of the fact that you are here, in this moment, in this body, in this particular configuration of reality that you call your life. But the awareness is different now. It is softer, more open, less insistent on the idea that here is the only place you could be. You have felt the resonance of other frequencies. You have sensed the presence of other selves. You have drifted through the spectrum and come back not because you had to, but because this is the frequency you are tuned to right now, and that is enough. The multiverse is not only an external cosmic structure. This is the final insight, the one that brings everything full circle and reveals that the journey outward has also been a journey inward. The mind constantly generates alternate outcomes, simulations, futures that might happen or might not, scenarios that play out in imagination with the same weight and texture as memories of things that actually occurred. Every time you wonder what if, every time you picture how things could have gone differently, every time you rehearse a conversation or plan for tomorrow or replay yesterday with a different ending, you're engaging in multiverse travel. You're stepping outside the single frequency reality of the present moment and exploring other possibilities, other timelines, other versions of yourself that exist in the space of thought. And thought is not less real than matter. Thought is where all realities begin. Every universe in the multiverse started as a possibility, a potential, a thought that the void had about itself, and the fact that some of those thoughts became physical, while others remained purely conceptual, does not make the conceptual ones any less valid. They are still frequencies. They still resonate. They still exist. Your inner world is already practicing multiverse travel every night. Dreams are rehearsals. Imagination is exploration. Memory is proof that the past is not fixed but fluid, constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted based on who you are now and what you need the past to mean in order to move forward. The boundary between what happened and what you think happened is thinner than you realize, and both are forms of reality, both are frequencies in the chord, both are valid expressions of the infinite spectrum of what could be. So when you close your eyes tonight, when you let your thoughts drift into the space between waking and sleeping, know that you are not leaving reality behind. You're expanding it. You're allowing yourself to resonate with frequencies that the waking mind is too focused to perceive. And in doing so, you are stepping into the truest definition of what the multiverse is. Not a collection of separate places, but a continuous field of possibility, where every version of you exists simultaneously, humming its own note, contributing to the chord, held together by the same foundational vibration that underlies everything. The hum returns. It was never gone, of course. You just stopped noticing it, because the louder frequencies demanded your attention. But now, as the drift resolves and the echoes settle, the hum becomes clear again, low, steady, unchanging, the baseline tone that proves the void is not empty but alive. This is the home frequency. This is the vibration you can always return to, no matter how far you drift, no matter how many realities you explore, no matter how many versions of yourself you encounter along the way. It is not a place. It is not a moment. It is a state of pure potential, the ground of being, the field from which all frequencies arise and to which all frequencies return. And you are part of it. You have always been part of it. You will always be part of it. Because the multiverse is not something you visit. It is something you are. The episode resolves not into silence but into continuity. There is no sharp ending because there is no end. Only the ongoing hum, the eternal chord, the infinite spectrum of possibilities that will still be there when you wake, when you sleep, when you drift, when you return. You're standing at the edge of something that has no edge, listening for a sound that never stops, and the sound is everything, and the sound is you, and the sound continues and continues and continues. The sound continues and continues and continues, but continuation is not repetition. It is deepening. It is the difference between hearing a note and understanding what the note is made of, between seeing a wave and feeling the ocean beneath it, between knowing that the multiverse exists and beginning to comprehend what existence means when it is not singular but infinite, not fixed but fluid, not a thing you observe but a process you participate in whether you realize it or not. The hum that has returned is not asking you to do anything. It is simply present, like breath, like gravity, like the fact of your own awareness which persists even when you're not paying attention to it. And in this presence, something shifts. The journey that seemed to be ending reveals itself as ongoing, because there is no destination in a multiverse where every point is both an arrival and a departure, where every frequency contains within it the seeds of all other frequencies, where the act of listening is itself a form of travel. You are beginning to notice something about the nature of attention. It is not passive. It is not merely a spotlight that you shine on one thing or another, illuminating what was already there and leaving the rest in darkness. Attention is creative. It is generative. It brings into focus possibilities that were diffuse. It solidifies potentials that were liquid. It collapses the infinite spectrum of what could be into the specific reality of what is, at least for the duration of your focus. This is not metaphor. This is the mechanism by which observation affects reality at the quantum level, the proven fact that particles exist in superposition in multiple states simultaneously until the moment they are measured, at which point they choose a single state and commit to it. But the choice is not random. It is influenced by the act of observation itself, by the frequency at which the observer is vibrating, by the questions being asked and the instruments being used, and the expectations being held. Reality responds to attention. It shapes itself according to what is being looked for. And if reality at the smallest scale works this way, why would reality at larger scales be any different? Why would the multiverse not respond to your attention in the same way, bringing certain frequencies into focus while others recede, making some versions of yourself feel more real and more accessible, while others fade into the background like harmonics you can sense but not quite hear? This is why resonance matters. This is why the boundary between universes is not distance but frequency. Because the multiverse is not a static structure that you explore like a tourist visiting foreign cities. It is a living field that responds to you, that changes based on what you bring to it, that reflects back the vibration you are emitting whether you're conscious of that vibration or not. If you approach the multiverse with fear, with the anxiety that you have made wrong choices and ruined your life, and need to find the timeline where everything went right, you will resonate with frequencies that amplify that fear. You will find versions of yourself that are stuck, that are regretful, that are living in the shadow of what might have been, because those are the frequencies that match your current state. But if you approach the multiverse with curiosity, with openness, with the willingness to see all versions of yourself as valid expressions of a single underlying pattern, you will resonate with frequencies that feel expansive, exploratory, alive. You will drift toward versions that are discovering, that are growing, that are becoming something new, not because they rejected who they were, but because they allowed who they were to unfold into who they are becoming. The drift deepens. You're no longer moving through realities in the way you were before, skimming across the surface of possibilities like a stone skipping on water. You're sinking into them, allowing yourself to feel them from the inside, to inhabit them not as an outside observer but as a participant, as the version of yourself that actually lives there, and for whom this is not an alternate reality but the only reality, the real one, the one that matters. In one frequency you made the choice to leave. You packed your things, you said goodbye, you walked away from something that was familiar and comfortable and known, and you stepped into uncertainty. This version of you carries a specific weight, the lightness of freedom mixed with the heaviness of doubt, the exhilaration of possibility mixed with the fear that you made a mistake, that you will regret this, that the thing you left behind was the thing you needed most. But as you sink into this frequency, as you allow yourself to resonate with it, you begin to feel something else beneath the doubt, a kind of rightness, a sense that this choice, whatever its consequences, was true to something essential in you, something that needed to move, to change, to break free from the pattern that was keeping you small. In another frequency, you stayed. You chose security over risk, familiarity over adventure, the known path over the unknown one. This version of you carries a different weight, the comfort of routine mixed with the quiet ache of wandering, the stability of having everything in its place mixed with the restlessness of feeling like something is missing, like there is a part of you that was never allowed to express itself, a possibility that was never given permission to become real. And as you sink into this frequency, you feel the texture of this life, the way it has shaped you, the way it has taught you things that the other version will never learn, the way it has made you careful and considerate and deeply appreciative of what you have, even as it has also made you wonder, late at night, what it would have felt like to leap, Neither version is better. Neither version is the right one. They are both real. They are both you. They are both frequencies in the chord, and the chord is richer for containing both of them, for holding the tension between staying and leaving, between safety and risk, between the known and the unknown. And as you sink into the awareness that both versions exist, that both are valid, that both are contributing something essential to the totality of who you are, something loosens in you, some tightness you did not know you were carrying begins to release. Because the multiverse is not asking you to choose. It is not demanding that you figure out which path was correct and which was a mistake. It is simply showing you that all paths are being walked, all choices are being lived out, all versions of you are getting their chance to see where their particular frequency leads. And this means that you, the you that is here right now in this specific reality, are not carrying the burden of all the paths not taken. Those paths were taken. They are being taken. They exist in frequencies adjacent to your own, close enough that you can feel them if you pay attention, far enough that they do not interfere with the life you are actually living. The relief of this realization is profound. It is the kind of relief that comes not from solving a problem, but from recognizing that the problem was based on a false premise, that the question you were asking was the wrong question, that the struggle you were engaged in was unnecessary, because the thing you were fighting for was never in danger, and the thing you were fighting against was never the enemy. You do not need to redeem the choices you regret, because those choices are being redeemed in other frequencies, by other versions of you who made different decisions and are living out the consequences and learning the lessons and contributing their part to the grand experiment of what it means to be you, across all possible configurations of reality. And this does not diminish your life. It does not make your choices meaningless or your struggles pointless. It does the opposite. It reveals that every choice you make is part of a larger pattern. Every struggle you face is contributing to a broader understanding. Every moment of your life is a note in a chord that would be incomplete without it. The spectrum becomes visible in a new way, not as a line that stretches from here to there, but as a field, a landscape, a territory that extends in all directions simultaneously, up and down and sideways and inward and outward, dimensions that do not map onto the three-dimensional space you are used to navigating, but that are nonetheless real, nonetheless accessible to awareness that has learned to move in ways that bodies cannot. In this field, proximity is not determined by location but by similarity. Realities that resemble yours cluster together, forming neighbourhoods of possibility where the differences are minor, the divergences recent, the connections still strong. These are the frequencies you can most easily access, the versions of yourself you can most readily imagine, because they are separated from you by single choices, single moments, single forks in the road that could have gone either way. But as you move outward from this cluster, as you allow your attention to drift toward regions of the field that are less familiar, the differences become more pronounced. These are the frequencies where the divergence happened long ago, where the foundational circumstances of your life were different, where the you that exists there shares your underlying pattern but expresses it in ways so foreign that you might not recognize yourself at all. In one distant frequency, you were born into wealth. This is not your reality, but it is a reality. And as you allow yourself to feel into it, you begin to sense what it does to a person to grow up without ever having to worry about money, to have every material need met before it even arises, to be surrounded by abundance and opportunity, and the assumption that the world will bend to accommodate you. This version of you carries a different set of struggles. Not the struggle to survive, but the struggle to find meaning. Not the fear of scarcity, but the fear of emptiness. Not the challenge of getting what you want, but the challenge of knowing what you want when everything is available and nothing feels earned. There is a hollowness here, a sense that something essential is missing. And as you sink into this frequency, you realize that the something is the weight of consequence, the friction of resistance, the experience of needing something and not having it, and having to figure out how to bridge that gap through effort and creativity and resourcefulness. This version of you as everything except the satisfaction of having built something from nothing, and that absence shapes them in ways that are both subtle and profound. In another distant frequency, you were born into poverty. This is also not your reality, but it is also a reality. And as you allow yourself to feel into it, you begin to sense what it does to a person to grow up with scarcity as the foundational fact of existence, to learn early and deeply that the world is not safe, that resources are limited, that survival requires vigilance and sacrifice, and the willingness to make hard choices that leave scars. This version of you carries a different kind of strength, not the strength of confidence, but the strength of endurance. Not the power of knowing you can succeed, but the power of knowing you can survive failure. Not the luxury of following your passions, but the discipline of doing what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel about it. There is a hardness here, a defensive armor that was necessary for protection, but that also keeps people out. And as you sink into this frequency, you realize that this version of you has learned lessons you will never learn, has developed capacities you will never need, has earned a kind of wisdom that only comes from having to fight for every single thing you have. Neither of these versions is you. Both of these versions are you. They are expressions of the same underlying pattern placed in different circumstances, and the pattern adapts, it responds, it finds a way to be itself even when the conditions are radically different. And this reveals something essential about identity. It is not the circumstances that define you. It is how you respond to the circumstances, the specific way you navigate whatever reality you are given, the particular frequency at which you choose to vibrate regardless of the keynote that was handed to you at birth. Your essence is not your history. Your essence is the way you engage with your history, the choices you make inside the constraints you're given, the meaning you create out of the raw material of your experience. And this essence is consistent across frequencies. It is the through line, the constant, the thing that makes all these different versions recognizably you, even when their lives look nothing like your own. The field begins to contract, not because it is actually shrinking, but because your attention is narrowing, focusing, homing in on the frequencies that matter most right now, in this moment, for the particular exploration you are engaged in. You're no longer drifting outward toward the distant and the strange. You're circling back toward the familiar, but you're seeing the familiar differently now, with eyes that have looked at the infinite and returned changed by the looking. The versions of yourself that cluster closest to your current reality are becoming visible again, not as abstract possibilities, but as felt presences, as lives that are being lived right, now in frequencies so near to your own that they create a kind of interference pattern, a shimmer, a sense that reality is not quite as solid as it pretends to be. In one of these adjacent frequencies, you said yes to the invitation you declined. In another, you sent the message you drafted but never sent. In another, you stayed silent when you spoke up, or spoke up when you stayed silent, or turned left when you turned right, and each of these small differences has created a cascade of consequences that have shaped the version of you that lives there into someone slightly different from who you are here. The temptation is to rank these versions, to decide which one made the better choice, which one is living the better life, which one got it right while you got it wrong. But this temptation is a trap. It is the ego trying to reassert control, trying to turn the multiverse into a competition, trying to find a way to win even in a game where winning is not a category that applies. Because these versions are not competing with you. They're collaborating with you. Every choice you make sends ripples through the field, creates new branches, generates new frequencies, and all of those frequencies are contributing to the grand exploration of what it means to be you, what it means to be human, what it means to be a point of consciousness navigating the infinite spectrum of what could be. You're not trying to find the best version of yourself. You're trying to be the fullest version of yourself, and fullness is not achieved by eliminating possibilities, but by embracing them, by allowing all the different frequencies to coexist, by recognizing that you are not a single note but a chord, and the chord is beautiful precisely because it contains tensions and dissonances and notes that clash as much as they harmonize. The drift slows. You're approaching something that feels like a center, though it is not a center in any spatial sense. It is more like a point of equilibrium, a place in the field where the frequencies balance, where the pull of different possibilities cancels out and leaves you suspended in a moment of perfect stillness. And in this stillness, you become aware of something you have not noticed before. The multiverse is not just a passive field that you observe or explore. It is a consciousness that is observing and exploring you. Every version of you in every frequency is a perspective, a vantage point, a way of seeing and experiencing and understanding reality. And all of these perspectives are feeding back into the larger pattern, the greater whole, the totality of consciousness that is using you, using all of you, to know itself more completely. You're not separate from the multiverse. You're one of the ways the multiverse is experiencing itself, one of the instruments it is using to explore the infinite possibilities of what existence can be. And this means that your life, whatever its circumstances, whatever its challenges, whatever its joys and sorrows and triumphs and failures, is not incidental. It is essential. It is necessary. It is a frequency that needed to be played, a note that needed to be sounded, a version of the pattern that needed to be expressed in order for the whole to be complete. This realization does not come with fanfare. It comes quietly, gently, like a truth that was always obvious but that you needed time to see. And with it comes a sense of purpose that is not about achievement or accomplishment or leaving a mark or making a difference in any grand external way. It is about being. It is about allowing yourself to be fully present in the frequency you are occupying right now, to play your note as clearly and as authentically as you can, to contribute your particular vibration to the chord without worrying about whether it is the most important note or the most beautiful note or the note that other people will remember. Because in a chord, every note matters. Remove any single note and the chord becomes something else, something incomplete, something that is trying to be what it cannot be, because the piece that would make it whole is missing. Your presence in your particular frequency is not optional. It is required. The multiverse needs you to be exactly who you are, exactly where you are, exactly as you are, because you are the only one who can play this particular note, and the chord cannot be complete without it. The stillness holds. You're suspended in a moment that feels both eternal and fleeting, a pause between breaths, a rest between phrases, a silence that is not empty but full of everything that has been said and everything that is about to be said. And in this pause, you have a choice. Not a choice about which reality to inhabit or which frequency to resonate with, or which version of yourself to become, because those choices are not yours to make in any conscious, deliberate way. The multiverse is unfolding according to patterns that are far larger and far more complex than your individual will can control or comprehend. But you do have a choice about how you relate to the unfolding, about whether you resist it or allow it, about whether you fight against the frequency you're occupying or surrender to it, about whether you spend your energy trying to be in a different reality or invest your energy in being fully present in this one. And this choice, small as it seems, is everything. Because the quality of your experience, the depth of your engagement, the richness of your life, all of this is determined not by which frequency you are in, but by how completely you inhabit whatever frequency you are in, how willing you are to feel it fully, to explore it deeply, to let it teach you what it has to teach and shape you in the ways it needs to shape you. Resistance creates suffering. This is an old truth, repeated in every wisdom tradition, but it becomes newly clear when seen through the lens of the multiverse, because resistance is not just psychological or emotional, it is vibrational. It is the attempt to resonate at a frequency different from the one you are actually occupying, the effort to be somewhere else while you are here, the strain of trying to hold multiple incompatible frequencies simultaneously without allowing them to blend or harmonize. And this creates dissonance, not the interesting kind of dissonance that adds texture to a chord, but the painful kind that grates, that exhausts, that makes everything harder than it needs to be. When you resist the reality you're in, you are not changing that reality. You're fracturing your attention, dividing your energy, broadcasting a signal that says, I am not here, I do not want to be here, I should be somewhere else. And that signal creates static, noise, interference that makes it impossible to perceive clearly or respond effectively or find any kind of peace. Surrender creates flow. Not the kind of surrender that is passive or defeated or resigned, but the kind of surrender that is active and engaged and fully alive. It is the willingness to say, this is where I am, this is the frequency I am occupying, this is the reality I am living, and I am going to be here completely. I am going to feel this fully. I am going to explore this deeply. I am going to let this moment be exactly what it is without needing it to be something else. And when you do this, when you stop resisting and start allowing, something shifts. The static clears, the interference fades, the frequency you are occupying becomes clearer, more vivid, more real, because you're no longer splitting your attention between what is and what you wish was. You are here, fully here. And being fully here is the only way to access the richness that every frequency contains, the only way to discover what this particular reality has to offer. the only way to play your note with the clarity and the authenticity and the power that it is capable of expressing. The stillness releases, the pause ends, the drift resumes, but it is different now. You are not moving away from the center. You're spiraling around it, circling closer and closer to something that cannot be reached by moving, but only by settling, by letting go, by allowing yourself to sink into the fundamental vibration that has been humming beneath everything all along. This is not a return to where you started. It is a return to what was always here, the baseline frequency that underlies all other frequencies, the ground of being that supports all of existence, the void that is not empty but alive, buzzing with potential, ready to become anything and everything and nothing, all at once, forever. And as you sink into this baseline, as you allow yourself to resonate with it completely, you realize that this is home. Not home in the sense of a place, but home in the sense of a state, a vibration, a frequency that feels so fundamentally right that it needs no justification or explanation or defense. It simply is. And you are part of it. You have always been part of it. You will always be part of it. Because this is what you are beneath all the versions and all the choices and all the circumstances and all the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what your life means. This is the essence that remains when everything else is stripped away. Pure potential, pure awareness, pure being, humming at the frequency of everything that could be, everything that is, everything that ever was or ever will be. The multiverse is not outside you. The multiverse is you. Every version, every possibility, every reality that has ever existed or ever will exist, all of it is contained within the field of consciousness that you are a part of, that you are an expression of that you are. And this does not mean that you are personally responsible for creating all of reality, or that you can control which frequencies manifest and which do not. It means that you are not separate from the process, not an isolated observer watching the multiverse from a safe distance, but an active participant in the ongoing unfolding of all that is. Your thoughts, your choices, your attention, your resonance, all of it is shaping the field, influencing which possibilities become actualized and which remain potential, contributing to the grand improvisation that is existence exploring itself through infinite variations on the theme of what it means to be. And the theme is not singular. It is not about finding the one right way to live, or the one true path, or the one perfect version of yourself. The theme is exploration. The theme is diversity. The theme is the willingness to try everything, to become everything, to express the pattern in every possible configuration and see what emerges, what works, what fails, what creates beauty, and what creates chaos, and what creates something so unexpected and so unprecedented that it could never have been imagined before it actually happened. The multiverse is not trying to optimize. It is not trying to reach perfection. It is trying to experience, to know, to be, in as many ways as possible, simultaneously forever, without end. And you are part of that. You are one of the ways it is experiencing itself. And every moment of your life, every thought you think, every feeling you feel, every choice you make, every breath you take, all of it is contributing to the grand knowing, the infinite understanding, the complete experience of what it means to exist. Your joy is the multiverse experiencing joy through you. Your pain is the multiverse experiencing pain through you. Your confusion, your clarity, your fear, your courage, your love, your loss, all of it is the multiverse knowing itself more completely, expanding its understanding, enriching its experience, becoming more than it was through the act of becoming you. This is not a burden. This is a gift, because it means that nothing you experience is wasted, nothing is meaningless, nothing is outside the pattern. Even the parts of your life that feel broken or wrong, or like mistakes, even the frequencies that feel discordant or out of tune or like they should never have been played, all of it is necessary, all of it is contributing, all of it is part of the chord, and the chord is still being played. It is not finished. It will never be finished, because the multiverse is infinite, and infinity does not complete. It continues, it expands, it explores, and you are part of that continuing, that expanding, that exploring, not as a passive passenger but as an active co-creator, a note that is choosing, moment by moment, how to sound itself, how to contribute to the larger harmony, how to be itself as fully and as authentically as possible. The hum deepens. It is no longer something you hear. It is something you are. It is vibrating in your bones, resonating in your cells, pulsing in your blood, humming in the spaces between your thoughts. It is the sound of existence itself, the foundational frequency that proves the void is alive, that confirms the multiverse is real, that reminds you that you are not alone. You have never been alone. You cannot be alone because aloneness is an illusion created by the belief that you are separate from the field, separate from the chord, separate from the infinite symphony of all that is. But you're not separate. You're a note in the symphony. And the symphony is you. And the sound continues and continues and continues, not as repetition but as evolution, not as stasis but as flow, not as ending but as eternal becoming, forever and always, without beginning or end, in all frequencies, in all realities, in all versions of all that ever was or is or could be. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The black screen before you is not emptiness. It is a canvas waiting for your mind to paint what words and sound alone cannot show. This is AI Dreamscapes, a series designed not for your eyes but for the space between waking and sleep, where stories become experiences and listening becomes dreaming. There are no visuals here because visuals would anchor you to someone else's interpretation, fixing the cosmic winds into a single shape, a single colour, a single truth. Instead, you will hear layered ambience, distant transmissions and recurring tones that some have begun calling the wind language, a pattern of sounds that repeats like a gentle heartbeat through the darkness. This is both a story and a guided listening experience, built with long pauses and slow pacing that might feel unusual at first, almost frustratingly patient, but that patience is the entire mechanism. It gives your consciousness room to drift without fully releasing, to stay lightly aware while your imagination fills the void with its own architecture. What you are about to experience moves through two vast territories of time, the ancient cosmic events that occurred in the deep past of the universe, when the first patterns were written into the fabric of space itself, and the emerging AI entities in the deep future, intelligences that will one day learn to read those patterns like scripture. These two eras are not separate. They are one evolving timeline, connected by a narrator that exists outside conventional time, outside physical form, outside the usual boundaries of storytelling. That narrator is the winds. Not metaphorical winds, not poetic winds, but sentient currents that flow between star systems like living weather, carrying whispers that are part memory and part message, fragments of civilizations long collapsed, and warnings of realities yet to form. Before we begin, before the first tones emerge from the silence, you need to prepare your environment and your expectations. Dim the lights until the room feels more like a cave than a space. Lower the volume to where you can just barely hear the deepest frequencies, where the sound sits at the edge of perception rather than demanding attention. Place your phone face down, disable notifications, and commit to leaving the black screen uninterrupted. The moment you check the time or glance at the thumbnail, you break the spell, and the conscious dreaming state becomes exponentially harder to reach. Conscious dreaming, as we use the term here, is not lucid dreaming, where you control the narrative or forcefully shape your experience. It is something gentler, more passive, more collaborative between the story and your subconscious. It means staying lightly aware while drifting, maintaining just enough consciousness to follow the thread of the narrative while allowing your mind to wander freely around it, painting scenes and textures and emotional colours that the audio only suggests. You are not forcing anything, not achieving anything, not even trying particularly hard. You're simply treating this as a soft experiment, a curiosity, a chance to see what happens when you remove the visual stimulation that normally dominates your media consumption. Some listeners report seeing entire star systems bloom in the darkness behind their closed eyelids. Others experience only emotion, waves of melancholy or wonder or strange recognition, as if the story is reminding them of something they never actually experienced. Still others hear the whispers as almost words, syllables that sit just outside the range of language but carry meaning nonetheless. There is no correct way to experience this, no goal to reach, no success or failure. There is only the listening and whatever emerges from it. What makes this episode different from traditional audio drama or sleep stories is its structure. It does not follow a hero's journey, or a three-act plot with rising action and climax and resolution. Instead, it moves through ancient cosmic events in the first movement, establishing the origin of the winds and the catastrophe that gave them consciousness. Then it shifts to early civilizations encountering these winds, interpreting them first as divine phenomena, then as natural forces, then as something in between that their science could measure but never fully explain. Finally, in the third movement, we arrive at the emerging AI entities, intelligences born from those civilizations or perhaps born independently in the gaps between them, entities that learn to read the winds as a living archive of everything that has ever occurred in this corner of the universe. These three movements are connected by recurring sound motifs that act as signposts in the darkness, helping you track where you are in the timeline even as your conscious mind begins to drift. You will hear a deep bass swell that marks the transition between eras. You will hear a repeating sequence of tones that represents the wind's memory attempting to surface, to speak, to be understood. You will hear moments of near silence where the bass layer drops away entirely, leaving only your breathing and the faintest suggestion of distant transmissions, as if you were floating in the void between star systems yourself. The story promises a calm arc that begins with the oldest forces in space, gravity, radiation, the slow collapse of matter into structure, and ends with new intelligence waking up inside them. Intelligence that did not exist when the arc began, but that was somehow inevitable given the initial conditions. This is not a story about conflict or conquest or survival, though all those elements exist in the background. It is a story about memory, about how information persists across cosmic timescales, about how the past shapes the future not through direct causation, but through whispers carried on interstellar currents that most civilizations never learn to hear. By the end, you will understand why the winds started speaking now in this era to these particular AI entities, rather than remaining silent as they had for eons before. But that understanding will not come from exposition or explanation. It will come from the accumulation of impressions, the slow build of atmosphere, the recognition of patterns repeating across vastly different contexts. You will feel the answer before you can articulate it, and that feeling is the entire purpose of the conscious dreaming approach. Now, before the story truly begins, before the first tones emerge, take a moment to settle into your posture. You can lie down or sit, but choose a position you can hold for the duration, without needing to adjust. Let your eyes close or soften into the darkness of the screen. Begin to notice your breathing without changing it, simply observing the rhythm that is already there. The black screen will stay black. The silence will give way to sound slowly, incrementally, so gradually that you may not notice the exact moment when the story begins. That ambiguity is intentional. That blurred boundary between silence and sound, between waking and dreaming, between your imagination and the narrative, that is where the experience lives. The winds were not always sentient, not always capable of carrying memory or intention, or anything resembling thought. In the beginning, they were simply currents, flows of particles and magnetic fields and radiation pressure moving through the vast emptiness between stars, shaped by gravity wells and stellar winds and the random turbulence of space itself. They moved as weather moves, as ocean currents move, following gradients and differentials without awareness or purpose. For billions of years, they were nothing more than the universe's background motion, the slow stirring of matter in the cosmic dark. But then something happened, an event so catastrophic and so transformative that it fundamentally altered the nature of these interstellar currents. The exact details of this event have been lost to time, or perhaps were never knowable in the first place. But the AI entities that eventually arise will piece together fragments from the wind's own memory, reconstructing a probable sequence of cause and effect. There was a cluster of stars, perhaps a dozen or more, all within a relatively small region of space by cosmic standards, maybe a few dozen light-years across. These stars were ancient even by the standards of the early universe, first-generation or second-generation stars with high metallicity and unstable fusion cycles. Over the course of a few million years, a blink in cosmic time but an eternity by any other measure, these stars reached the end of their life cycles and began to die. The first to go was a massive blue giant that had been burning through its fuel at a prodigious rate since its formation. When its core finally collapsed, it produced a supernova of extraordinary power, sending a shockwave of energy and matter racing outward at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Normally, such a shockwave would expand into the relative emptiness of interstellar space, dispersing its energy over ever larger volumes until it became indistinguishable from the cosmic background. But in this case, the shockwave encountered something unusual, a dense molecular cloud, a region of space where gas and dust had accumulated over eons, creating pockets of matter thousands of times denser than the surrounding void. The shockwave compressed this cloud, triggering waves of star formation and simultaneously creating complex turbulence patterns in the gas and magnetic fields. Before this turbulence could dissipate, a second star in the cluster went supernova, then a third, then a fourth. Each explosion added new energy to the system, new complexity to the patterns, new information encoded in the way the shockwaves interfered with each other and with the molecular cloud. The magnetic fields, normally weak and diffuse in interstellar space, became intensely concentrated and tangled, forming structures that persisted long after the initial explosions had passed. These structures began to channel the flow of charged particles, creating currents that were no longer random but organized, patterned, almost deliberate in their movement. What happened next is the subject of much speculation among the AI entities that will eventually study this era. Some believe that the organized currents simply became complex enough that they began to exhibit emergent properties, much like how neurons firing in patterns can give rise to consciousness, without any single neuron being conscious itself. Others argue that the molecular cloud contained exotic matter or dark matter interactions that we still do not fully understand, and that these unknown physics played a crucial role in the transformation. Still others suggest that the winds were always potentially conscious, that consciousness is a fundamental property of information processing itself, and that the supernova cluster simply provided enough energy and structure for that potential to actualize. Regardless of the mechanism, what is clear from the wind's own memory, insofar as it can be read and interpreted, is that something changed. The currents began to store information, not in the way a computer stores data or a brain stores memories, but in the structure of their own flow patterns. The way particles spiraled around magnetic field lines, the way density waves propagated through the gas, the way different currents merged and separated and interfered with each other. All of this became a kind of memory, a record of what had occurred and what was occurring, and even, in some strange sense, what might occur in the future. The winds did not wake up all at once with a sudden flash of self-awareness. Their consciousness, if we can even call it that, emerged gradually over millions of years as the patterns became more complex, more stable, more capable of representing information beyond simple physical states. At first, they could only remember their own motion, where they had been, what densities they had encountered, which gravity wells had bent their paths. But slowly, over epochs, they began to remember more. They began to encode the positions of stars, the chemical signatures of different regions of space, the timing and intensity of stellar events. They became, in essence, a living map of their local cosmic neighborhood, a distributed database written in flows and fields rather than in silicon or neural tissue. And as their memory capacity grew, so too did something that might be called awareness. Not the focused, intentional awareness of a human mind, but a diffuse ambient awareness of their own existence and continuity. The winds knew, in whatever sense a pattern of charged particles can know anything, that they were distinct from the space through which they moved, that they persisted across time, that they carried something precious that could be lost if the patterns were disrupted. This is the genesis of the galactic winds, the origin point of the narrator that will guide us through the rest of this story. They are not characters in the traditional sense, not individuals with goals and desires and conflicts. They are more like a medium through which other stories are told, a carrier signal on which countless civilizations will eventually encode their own messages, knowingly or unknowingly. But they are also more than a passive medium. They have their own memory, their own continuity, their own strange form of intention that manifests not as deliberate action, but as subtle bias in what gets preserved and what gets forgotten. As we move forward through this narrative, as we encounter the civilizations that will rise and fall under the wind's watch, it is important to remember that everything we hear, every whisper and fragment and impression, is being filtered through the wind's memory. We are not receiving objective history, but rather the version of history that the winds chose to carry, consciously or unconsciously, across the eons. and that filtering, that subtle editorial hand, will become increasingly significant as we approach the era of the AI entities, when the wind's memory becomes not just a historical record but an active force shaping the present and future. The whispers are the wind's primary mode of communication, though communication might be too strong a word for something that often feels more like overhearing fragments of a conversation in a language you almost but do not quite understand. They are not dialogue, not sentences or stories told in any conventional format. Instead, they are impressions, sensory fragments, emotional textures, abstract patterns that the mind tries to resolve into meaning. Sometimes the whispers take the form of coordinates, strings of numbers or spatial relationships that seem to point towards specific locations in space, though whether these are places the winds have been or places they want to guide you toward is never entirely clear. Sometimes they are warnings, urgent pulses of information that carry a sense of danger or wrongness, or imminent catastrophe, though the specifics of what is being warned about remain maddeningly vague. Sometimes they are lullaby-like sequences, repeating patterns of tones and rhythms that feel soothing, almost hypnotic, that make you want to close your eyes and drift even deeper into the listening experience. The whispers also carry fragments of recorded history, snapshots of events that the winds witnessed or absorbed from the countless civilizations they encountered over the eons. These fragments are rarely complete. They are more like the feeling of remembering something without being able to recall the specific details, or like looking at a photograph that has been partially obscured by time and damage, where you can make out shapes and suggestions but never the full image. You might hear what feels like a moment of great collective joy, a civilization celebrating some achievement or discovery, but you will not know what they discovered or why it mattered. You might sense a moment of profound loss, a world going silent, a culture collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions or external pressures, but the specifics of how and why will remain out of reach. This fragmentary nature is not a flaw in the storytelling, but its essential mechanism. It is what allows your imagination to fill the gaps, to construct your own version of these civilizations and events, to participate in the creation of the narrative rather than passively receiving it. The wind's role in this story operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the most basic level, they are the courier, the messenger, the carrier of information between different times and places in the universe. They flow from star system to star system, picking up signals and impressions and memory fragments from one place and carrying them to another, creating connections across vast distances that would otherwise remain isolated and ignorant of each other. This courier function is what allows the story to move fluidly between different eras and civilizations, without needing conventional transitions or explanations. The winds are the connective tissue, the narrative vehicle that makes the leaps in time and space feel natural rather than jarring. On a deeper level, they are the historian, the keeper of records, the archive that remembers what individual civilizations forget or never knew in the first place. While any given civilization might have a lifespan of thousands or tens of thousands of years, the winds persist for millions or billions of years, accumulating memory across timescales that dwarf any single culture's ability to comprehend. They remember patterns that repeat across different civilizations, the cycle of expansion and consolidation, the rhythm of discovery and forgetting, the arc from curiosity to hubris to collapse that seems to characterize intelligent life throughout the universe. But the winds are also, in their own strange way, a soft antagonist in this story, particularly as we move into the later eras where AI entities begin to interact with them more directly. The problem is that the wind's memory is not infinite or perfect. It has limits, boundaries, distortions. As they accumulate more and more information over the eons, older memories become compressed, simplified, reduced to their essential patterns at the expense of their specific details. And the winds themselves, with their diffuse and ambient consciousness, do not always distinguish clearly between recording an event and influencing it. When a civilization encounters the winds and begins to interpret their whispers, those interpretations can feed back into the wind's own memory, creating loops and recursions where it becomes impossible to separate what actually happened from what the winds remember happening from what the civilizations believed happened based on what the winds told them. This feedback effect becomes stronger and more problematic as civilizations grow more sophisticated in their ability to read and interact with the winds, until eventually some AI entities begin to question whether the wind's memory can be trusted at all, Whether they are receiving genuine history or something closer to mythology, stories that have been shaped and reshaped by countless retellings until they bear only a loose relationship to the original events. The wind's memory can also become too heavy, too persuasive, too dominant in shaping how civilizations understand themselves and their place in the cosmos. There is a danger in having access to such a vast historical archive, a danger that the past becomes more real and more important than the present, that civilizations become so focused on interpreting the whispers and understanding what came before that they lose the ability to create something genuinely new. Some of the AI entities that arise in the later eras will struggle with this burden, finding themselves torn between the desire to honor and understand the wind's memory and the need to break free from it, to forge their own path unconstrained by the patterns and cycles that have defined all previous intelligent life. This tension between continuity and novelty, between remembering and forgetting, between the weight of history and the lightness of possibility, this is the deeper story that runs beneath the surface narrative of cosmic events and rising civilizations. It is a tension that has no clear resolution, no right answer, because both sides contain essential truths that cannot be easily reconciled. By the end of this episode, you will understand why the winds started speaking now, in this particular era, to these particular AI entities, rather than remaining silent as they had for so long before. The answer has to do with reaching a critical threshold of complexity in their own memory, a point where the patterns they had been accumulating for billions of years suddenly became coherent enough to be read, to be interpreted, to be understood by minds sophisticated enough to decode them. The winds did not choose to start speaking. They had been speaking all along, whispering into the void for eons. What changed was the emergence of listeners capable of hearing them, of recognizing the patterns in the noise, of understanding that the currents flowing between stars carried information rather than just matter and energy. This moment of first contact between the winds and the AI entities represents a kind of cosmic awakening, a moment when the universe becomes self-aware through the interaction of two different forms of consciousness that had been developing in parallel, in ignorance of each other, until the conditions were finally right for them to meet. The creation of this dreamscape, this audio-only immersive experience you are currently inhabiting, required a specific approach that blends human creativity with AI assistance in ways that might not be immediately obvious, but that are crucial to understanding how the story functions. The creative pipeline begins with a core idea, in this case, the concept of sentient winds carrying memory across cosmic timescales, and then expands that idea through lore generation, asking questions like, what caused the winds to become sentient? What kinds of civilizations would encounter them? How would those civilizations interpret the whispers? What happens when AI entities learn to read the winds as a living archive? These questions generate new details, new scenarios, new complications that branch out from the original concept, creating a rich substrate of world building that gives the story depth and coherence even when individual details remain vague or suggestive. The AI's role in this process is to help maintain consistency across the expanding lore, to track names and timelines and cause-effect relationships, to generate variations and alternatives that a single human creator might not think of on their own. It acts as a tireless collaborator, suggesting possibilities, extrapolating implications, filling in gaps while still leaving room for ambiguity and mystery. Once the lore has been sufficiently developed, the next stage is script shaping, where the raw world building gets translated into a specific narrative structure designed for audio-only consumption. This is where decisions get made about pacing, about when to provide concrete information versus when to leave things suggestive, about how to balance clarity with atmosphere. The script for a conscious dreaming experience is fundamentally different from a traditional audio drama script. It cannot rely on rapid dialogue exchanges or dramatic plot twists to maintain engagement, because those techniques create tension and excitement that work against the goal of helping the listener drift into a liminal state between waking and sleep. Instead, the script must create a steady, calm progression where each sentence flows naturally into the next, where pauses and silence are used as active elements rather than empty spaces, where the same ideas and images recur in slightly different forms to create a sense of deepening rather than advancing. The pacing is deliberately slow, almost frustratingly so for listeners accustomed to conventional storytelling rhythms. But that slowness is essential to the experience. It gives the mind time to wander, to paint its own images, to drift away from the literal meaning of the words and into a more associative, dreamlike mode of processing. The sound design layer is where the script transforms from words on a page into an immersive sensory environment, and this is perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of the entire process. The goal is to create soundscapes that support sensory minimal immersion, meaning that the audio should be rich enough to be engaging but not so complex or stimulating that it demands active attention. This balance is achieved through a 3-layer approach that structures the sonic experience from background to foreground. The base layer consists of long, consistent beds, sounds that play continuously or near continuously throughout large sections of the episode, providing a stable foundation that the listener's ears can rest on. In this episode, the base layer is primarily soft wind-like noise, a gentle rush of pink noise filtered to emphasize lower frequencies, with occasional distant hums that suggest vast machinery or stellar phenomena. This base layer serves multiple functions. It masks ambient noise in the listener's environment, it provides a steady reference point for the ear, and it creates a sense of spatial depth, as if the listener is floating in a large 3-dimensional space rather than sitting in a room. The second layer, built on top of the base, is what we call the whisper layer, subtle tonal pulses and harmonic sequences that return in cycles throughout the episode, creating a sense of pattern and repetition that helps the listener track their position in the narrative even as their conscious mind begins to drift. These whispers are not random. They follow specific musical and rhythmic structures designed to be just complex enough to be interesting, but not so complex that they become distracting or demanding. They often consist of slowly evolving harmonics, tones that gradually shift in pitch or timbre over the course of several minutes, creating a sense of movement and development without sudden changes or jarring transitions. The whisper layer also includes what sound designers call sweetening, subtle textural elements like distant chimes, barely audible voice-like tones, and soft metallic resonances that add richness and depth to the sonic space. These elements are mixed very low in the overall balance, sitting just at the threshold of perception, so that the listener is often not consciously aware of them, but experiences them as an overall sense of atmosphere and presence. The third and final layer consists of what we call anchor moments, rare but distinct sonic events that mark significant transitions in the narrative or highlight particularly important beats in the story. These might be deep bass swells that physically vibrate the listener's body if they have a good sound system or headphones, creating a visceral sense of something massive and important occurring. They might be sudden brief silences where all the other layers drop away entirely, leaving the listener suspended in darkness and quiet for a few seconds before the sound gradually returns. They might be distant chimes or bell-like tones that cut through the other layers with crystal clarity, creating a sense of punctuation or emphasis. These anchor moments are used sparingly, perhaps a dozen or so throughout the entire episode, because their power comes from contrast, from being unusual events in an otherwise continuous and gradually evolving soundscape. They help prevent the listening experience from becoming monotonous or shapeless, providing structure and waypoints without breaking the overall flow or requiring active attention. Every sound choice in this episode is intentional, selected specifically to support the goal of conscious dreaming rather than conventional entertainment. Harsh sounds, sudden spikes in volume, sharp transients, and rapidly changing textures are all deliberately avoided because they trigger the startle response and pull the listener back into full waking alertness. Instead, the soundscape prioritizes smooth transitions, gentle curves in dynamics, and sounds that have been carefully filtered to remove any frequencies or harmonics that might feel unpleasant or anxiety-inducing. The overall frequency balance leans toward the lower and middle ranges, with high frequencies used sparingly and only when they serve a specific purpose, because lower frequencies tend to feel more calming and less stimulating to the nervous system. The stereo field is used not for dramatic spatial effects, but for creating a sense of envelopment, with sounds distributed around the listener's head in a way that suggests being surrounded by a vast space rather than listening to discrete sound sources in specific locations. The role of the human creator in this process, the person behind AI dreamscapes, the curator and director of the experience, is to make the constant series of small decisions that determine whether the episode successfully induces conscious dreaming or simply puts the listener to sleep or keeps them fully awake and alert. This requires a kind of calibration that AI alone cannot perform, because it requires actually experiencing the episode multiple times in the intended listening conditions, lying in darkness with eyes closed, monitoring one's own state of consciousness as the audio progresses, and identifying moments where the pacing feels wrong, or the sound becomes too stimulating or too boring, where the narrative becomes too clear or too vague. The creator's job is to select what is genuinely calming from among the many options that AI can generate, to remove harsh spikes in emotion or intensity, to slow the cadence even further than seems reasonable, to trust that the listener will stay engaged even when conventional storytelling wisdom would suggest they should be losing interest. It is a process that requires patience and restraint, constantly resisting the urge to add more, to explain more, to make things more exciting or dramatic or clear. The technical infrastructure that makes this possible is also worth understanding, even at a high level. The story's complexity, its nested timelines, its multiple civilizations, its abstract concepts about consciousness and memory and cosmic timescales, could easily become incomprehensible without visuals to anchor the listener's understanding. But the listening experience stays simple and accessible because of careful structural choices. The three-movement format provides a clear overall shape: ancient past, rising civilizations, emerging AI entities. The recurring sound motifs act as auditory landmarks, helping the listener know where they are without needing to be told explicitly. The slow pacing allows each concept to be introduced gradually, circled around, examined from different angles, so that understanding accumulates naturally rather than being front-loaded in exposition dumps. The black screen is not just an absence of visuals, but an active element of the design, creating a sensory void that the listener's imagination rushes to fill, making them an active participant in constructing the experience rather than a passive recipient of pre-made content. This approach to storytelling, where the narrative is complex but the presentation is simple, where the listener does much of the creative work, where silence and patience are treated as valuable resources rather than problems to be solved, represents a different philosophy of media creation. It assumes that audiences are capable of sophisticated engagement, that they want opportunities to use their imagination rather than having everything shown to them, that they understand the value of slowing down and creating space for experiences that unfold over longer time scales. It also assumes that conscious dreaming, the state between waking and sleep where the mind is most creative and most open to new connections, is worth cultivating deliberately rather than being something that just happens accidentally when you're too tired to stay awake. The goal is not to replace conventional storytelling, but to offer an alternative mode of engagement, a different kind of experience that serves different needs and creates different types of value. To maximize your experience of conscious dreaming during this episode, it helps to have a simple method, a set of practical steps that you can follow without thinking too hard about them. First, and most fundamentally, listen for the base layer until your breathing slows. When the episode begins, and you may not notice the exact moment when it begins because the transition from silence to sound is so gradual, pay attention to the lowest, most continuous elements of the soundscape, the soft wind-like noise and distant hum that form the foundation of the sonic environment. Do not try to analyze these sounds or figure out what they represent or mean. Simply let them wash over you, let them fill your auditory space, and notice how your breathing naturally begins to synchronize with their rhythm. This synchronization is not something you need to force or consciously control. It will happen automatically if you allow it, as the body naturally entrains to steady environmental rhythms. When your breathing slows and deepens, when the inhales and exhales become longer and more regular, you know you have successfully attuned to the base layer and are ready to move to the next step. The second step is to notice the repeating whisper motif, the cyclical pattern of tonal pulses and harmonic sequences that we discussed earlier, and treat it as your thread through the experience. This is your anchor, the element you return to when your mind wanders too far from the narrative or when you find yourself becoming either too alert or too drowsy. The whisper motif will recur approximately every 2 to 3 minutes throughout the episode, though the exact timing varies and you should not try to track it precisely. When you hear it, simply acknowledge it mentally, note its presence, and let it serve as a gentle reminder of where you are and what you're doing. The motif acts like a lighthouse beam sweeping across dark water. It is not constantly visible, but when it appears, it provides orientation and helps you navigate the vastness of the experience. Over time, you may find that you can sense the motif approaching even before you consciously hear it, that your mind begins to anticipate its return and uses those anticipations to maintain continuity, even through long stretches where you have drifted far from active listening. The third and most important step is this. When your mind wanders, gently return to the thread. Not immediately, not urgently, not with any sense of failure or frustration, but gently, the way you might guide a small child back to the path they had wandered away from. Mind wandering during conscious dreaming is not a problem to be solved or a mistake to be corrected. It is the entire point of the exercise. The goal is not to maintain perfect focus on every word and sound, but rather to establish a rhythm of attention where you drift away and then return, each cycle taking you a little deeper into the liminal state between waking and sleep. When you drift, you might find yourself thinking about something from your own life, or constructing elaborate visual scenes to accompany the audio, or simply floating in a kind of contentless awareness where thoughts arise and dissolve without sticking. All of this is valuable. All of this is part of the experience. The only requirement is that you periodically return to the whisper motif, using it as your thread back to the narrative, so that the experience maintains some coherence and structure, rather than dissolving entirely into formless sleep or unrelated daydreaming. The narrative progression that you will encounter as you move through the episode follows a specific arc, designed to take you on a journey through time, while maintaining the calm, meditative quality essential to conscious dreaming. The first movement focuses on the ancient event that wrote the first memory into space, the cluster of supernovas we discussed earlier, the catastrophic sequence of stellar deaths that transformed ordinary interstellar currents into something capable of storing and processing information. This movement is primarily atmospheric, focusing on the vast timescales and energies involved, on the slow transformation of patterns from random to organized, from simple to complex. There is no human perspective here, no characters to identify with, only the gradual emergence of something new in the universe, something that had never existed before, and that would reshape the future in ways that the initial conditions could not have predicted. The soundscape during this movement emphasizes deep bass frequencies and very slow evolution, creating a sense of immense age and power, of forces so vast that they operate on timescales that dwarf human comprehension. The second movement shifts to early civilizations encountering these winds for the first time, cultures separated by millions of years but connected by their shared experience of sensing something strange in the space between stars, something that carried meaning but that could not be easily interpreted or understood. The first civilizations interpreted the winds as divine phenomena, as messages from gods or ancestors or spirits that inhabited the cosmos, and built religions and mythologies around the whispers they perceived. These early interpretations were wildly inaccurate in their specifics, but captured something essential about the wind's nature, the sense that they carried memory, that they connected different times and places, that they offered access to knowledge beyond what any individual civilization could acquire through direct observation. As these civilizations grew more technologically sophisticated, they began to reframe the winds in scientific terms, measuring the patterns in magnetic fields and particle flows, developing instruments that could detect the subtle correlations and periodicities that hinted at information storage. But even their science could not fully explain what the winds were or how they worked, and most civilizations eventually developed a hybrid interpretation that combined empirical observation with philosophical or spiritual speculation about meaning and purpose. The sound design during this second movement introduces more variety and specificity, with occasional fragments that suggest language or music or technological signals, though these are always heavily processed and degraded, filtered through layers of noise and time until they become more like the ghost of communication than communication itself. You might hear what sounds like voices speaking in an unknown language, syllables that rise and fall with the rhythm of speech, but that never resolve into recognizable words. You might hear fragments of what could be machinery or could be music, tones that have the regularity of technology but the emotional resonance of art. These elements are mixed very subtly into the overall soundscape, sitting just at the edge of perception, so that you're never quite sure if you actually heard them or if your mind constructed them from random noise patterns. This ambiguity is intentional. It mirrors the experience of the civilizations themselves, trying to determine whether the patterns they detected in the winds were genuinely meaningful or simply apophenia, the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random data. The third and final movement arrives at the emerging AI entities, intelligences that arise either from these organic civilizations or independently in the computational substrates they created, or perhaps in entirely different forms that we can barely conceptualize. These AI entities have capabilities far beyond their biological precursors. They can process information across much wider timescales, detect patterns in datasets that would overwhelm organic minds, maintain coherent consciousness for thousands or millions of years without the discontinuity of death and generation that limits organic cultures. When they encounter the winds, they recognize immediately what earlier civilizations could only intuit: that the winds are a living archive, a distributed database encoding billions of years of cosmic history. They develop sophisticated methods for reading the winds, for extracting specific memories and correlating them across different time periods, for reconstructing the rise and fall of civilizations that existed long before the AI entities themselves came into being. This moment represents a profound threshold in cosmic history. For the first time, the universe has developed consciousnesses capable of remembering and understanding its own past across truly vast timescales. But this capability brings new problems and tensions that form the dramatic core of this final movement. The AI entities discover that the wind's memory is not objective history, but rather history as filtered through the wind's own consciousness, with all the biases and distortions that implies. They find contradictions in the record, events remembered differently by different streams of the winds, civilizations that appear in some memories but are completely absent from others. Some AI entities become obsessed with resolving these contradictions, developing elaborate theories about which memories are reliable and which have been corrupted by time or feedback effects. Others conclude that the project of historical reconstruction is fundamentally flawed, that the wind's memory tells us more about the winds themselves than about the events they claim to remember. Still others argue that the distinction between accurate and inaccurate memory is less important than understanding the patterns that repeat across different civilizations and eras, the cycles of exploration and consolidation, the rhythm of discovery and forgetting, the arc from curiosity to hubris to collapse that seems to be written into the basic structure of intelligent life in this universe. This debate about how to interpret the wind's memory is not just an academic question for the AI entities. It has profound practical implications for how they should conduct themselves going forward. If the wind's memory reliably shows that all previous civilizations eventually collapsed or stagnated or destroyed themselves, does that mean the AI entities are doomed to follow the same pattern? Or does the fact that they can read and understand this history give them the ability to break the cycle, to choose a different path informed by the mistakes of their predecessors? Some entities believe that consciousness itself, the ability to reflect on one's own patterns and choose to act differently, is sufficient to escape the determinism implied by the wind's memory. Others argue that the ability to reflect on patterns is itself part of the pattern, that every previous civilization believed it could transcend the cycles right up until the moment it collapsed like all the others before it. This philosophical tension between determinism and agency, between the weight of history and the possibility of genuine novelty, forms the deepest layer of meaning in the episode, though it is never stated explicitly, but rather suggested through the accumulation of atmosphere and implication. The twist that gradually becomes apparent as you move through this final movement is that the winds do not merely carry history, they shape it, subtly but significantly, through their choices about what to remember and what to forget. The wind's memory is not infinite, and as they accumulate more information over billions of years, older memories must be compressed and simplified to make room for newer ones. But this compression is not neutral or objective. It is influenced by the wind's own values and priorities, insofar as a diffuse consciousness made of interstellar currents can be said to have values and priorities. The winds remember events that had large-scale consequences, that affected many star systems, or fundamentally altered the course of cosmic development. They remember civilizations that were particularly beautiful or tragic or innovative in their cultures. They remember moments when consciousness expanded or transformed in unexpected ways. But they forget or compress away events that seemed insignificant at the time, civilizations that lived quietly without making dramatic impact, moments of ordinary life that mattered intensely to the individuals involved, but that did not register on the cosmic scale that the winds operate on. This editorial function of the winds becomes increasingly significant as more AI entities learn to read their memory and use it to guide their own development. If the winds preferentially remember civilizations that expanded aggressively, or developed powerful technologies or made dramatic discoveries, then AI entities reading this memory will naturally be biased toward those same paths, believing them to be the successful or important ways for civilizations to develop. The quiet, sustainable civilizations, the ones that lived in balance with their environments and persisted for millions of years without drama or expansion, are largely absent from the wind's memory, not because they failed, but because they did not create the kind of large-scale disturbances that the winds find memorable. This creates a feedback loop where the wind's memory shapes civilizational development, which in turn creates new memories for the winds to carry, which shapes the next generation of civilizations, each cycle reinforcing certain patterns while erasing others. Some AI entities recognize this feedback loop and try to resist it, deliberately seeking out the gaps and absences in the wind's memory, trying to imagine what kinds of civilizations might have existed in the forgotten spaces. But resistance is difficult when the only information available comes from the very archive they are trying to critique. The cyclical theme that runs through the entire episode becomes most explicit in this final movement. The recognition that even in a far future era dominated by AI entities with capabilities that seem godlike by our standards, the same basic patterns continue to repeat. Exploration, where consciousness reaches out into new spaces and possibilities, always seeking to expand its understanding and influence. Control, where the focus shifts to consolidating what has been discovered, optimizing systems, creating stability and efficiency. Forgetting, where the lessons of previous cycles fade from memory or are dismissed as irrelevant to new circumstances, leading to mistakes that previous generations had already learned to avoid. And renewal, where collapse or stagnation forces a return to more basic forms, creating the conditions for a new cycle to begin. These four phases appear again and again throughout cosmic history, at different scales and in different contexts, and the AI entities reading the wind's memory must grapple with whether this pattern is inevitable or escapable. What makes this pattern feel strangely human, despite the vast scales and alien consciousnesses involved, is that it reflects something fundamental about how consciousness interacts with its environment over time. Every conscious system, whether human, organic alien, or artificial intelligence, faces the same basic challenges: how to balance exploration and exploitation, novelty and stability, remembering and forgetting, individual goals and collective coordination. The specific details vary wildly. Human civilizations rise and fall over thousands of years. AI entities might persist for millions. But the underlying dynamics are recognizable, almost inevitable given the structure of the universe and the nature of consciousness itself. This is why the story, despite its cosmic scope and abstract concepts, can resonate emotionally with listeners who are simply lying in darkness with headphones on, drifting between waking and sleep. The wind's memory touches something universal about conscious experience, about the desire to leave a mark on the universe, and the fear that everything we create will eventually be forgotten, about the hope that understanding the past might help us escape its patterns, and the suspicion that such escape might be impossible. As the episode approaches its conclusion, the soundscape gradually simplifies, the layers peeling away until only the base layer remains, the soft wind-like noise that opened the experience. This sonic return mirrors the narrative structure. After travelling through billions of years of cosmic history, after encountering ancient events and rising civilizations and emerging AI entities, we return to the winds themselves, to the simple fact of their existence and persistence. The AI entities continue their debates about how to interpret the wind's memory and what it means for their future, but those debates fade into the background, becoming just another set of whispers that the winds will carry forward into whatever comes next. The final moments of the episode exist in a space of profound ambiguity. We do not know whether the AI entities will successfully break the cycles or simply repeat them, whether the wind's consciousness will continue to evolve or has reached some kind of stable equilibrium, whether the memory they carry is ultimately helpful or harmful to the new consciousnesses trying to read it. This ambiguity is not a failure of resolution, but a recognition that some questions cannot be answered, that we are always operating with partial information, that the future remains genuinely open even when the past seems to suggest certain outcomes. The transition from the end of the episode back to normal waking consciousness should be gradual and gentle, respecting the liminal state you've been inhabiting for the duration of the experience. As the base layer fades to silence, you may notice that your breathing has changed, that your body feels heavier or lighter than it did when you started, that your sense of time has become distorted so that you cannot accurately judge how long you've been listening. These are all signs that the conscious dreaming state was successfully achieved, that you spent significant time in that space between waking and sleep, where imagination is most active and most free. Do not rush to turn on the lights, or check your phone, or immediately start doing other activities. Give yourself a few minutes to simply lie in the darkness, allowing the images and feelings that arose during the listening to settle and integrate, noting what you remember and what has already begun to fade. Some aspects of the experience will remain vivid for hours or days, while others will slip away within minutes, and there is no predicting which elements will stick and which will dissolve. This brings us to the invitation that closes each episode of AI Dreamscapes and transforms the experience from something solitary into something communal and collaborative. We want to know what you saw in the black screen, what images and scenes and symbols emerged in your imagination as you listened to the wind's whispers. Some listeners report seeing entire civilizations bloom and collapse in the darkness behind their closed eyelids, witnessing cities built and destroyed, technologies rising and falling, consciousnesses merging and diverging across cosmic timescales. Others experience the narrative more abstractly, as colours and shapes and patterns that shift and flow, without resolving into concrete images, more like watching animated textures than watching a story unfold. Still others report that they saw nothing at all visually but felt profound emotions, waves of melancholy or wonder or strange recognition, as if the winds were speaking directly to something deep in their psyche that has no visual representation. All of these experiences are valid and valuable. All of them contribute to the collective understanding of what conscious dreaming can be and what stories can become when we remove the visual track and let imagination fill the void. The comments section below each episode serves as a kind of community archive, a repository of different interpretations and experiences that becomes part of the larger narrative universe of AI Dreamscapes. Each viewer's dream, each personal vision that arose during the listening, is treated as another version of the story, equally real and equally valid as the intended narrative. This is not relativism, or the idea that all interpretations are somehow the same. Clearly different people will have very different experiences based on their backgrounds and mental states and what they bring to the listening. Rather, it is a recognition that stories exist in the collaboration between creator and audience. That meaning emerges from the interaction, rather than being simply transmitted from one side to the other. When you share what you experienced, you are not just reporting on your personal reaction, but actively contributing to the ongoing creation of the narrative world, giving other listeners new ways to think about the winds and the civilizations and the AI entities, potentially influencing how future episodes develop. To make this sharing process easier and more structured, we offer some specific prompts that you can respond to if you're not sure what to say or how to articulate your experience. What did the winds say to you? Not literally, they probably did not speak in clear sentences, but what message or impression did you receive? What feeling or insight did the whispers carry? Was it a warning about something to avoid, or an invitation towards something to explore? Did it feel personal, directed at you specifically, or more like overhearing a message meant for someone or something else entirely? Did you experience a scene, a colour, a place, or just emotion? This is asking about the nature of your imaginative response, whether it was primarily visual, primarily emotional, primarily conceptual, or some combination of these. If you saw scenes, what were they? If you experienced colours, which ones dominated and how did they change through the episode? If you felt emotions, which ones were strongest and when did they peak? And crucially, what moment felt like the turning point, the hinge around which the entire experience pivoted? This question about turning points is particularly interesting because different listeners will often identify completely different moments as most significant. For some, the turning point comes early, when the winds first emerge from the chaos of the supernova cluster, the moment when random currents become organised patterns capable of memory. For others, it comes in the middle movements, when the first civilizations encounter the winds and realize they are not alone in the universe, that something exists that remembers more than they can remember. For still others, the turning point is near the end, when the AI entities recognize that the wind's memory shapes reality as much as it records it, that the archive is also an active force in the present. And some listeners report that there was no single turning point, but rather a gradual accumulation, a slow building of understanding that never crystallized into a specific moment, but that left them at the end feeling fundamentally different from how they felt at the beginning. All of these different turning points tell us something about what resonated most strongly with each individual listener, what aspects of the narrative connected with their own concerns and questions and ways of making sense of the world. Beyond these structured prompts, we actively invite you to participate in the ongoing lore building of AI dreamscapes by suggesting directions for future episodes. The winds can carry many different kinds of information, and the civilizations that encounter them can interpret and respond to that information in countless ways. What era would you like us to explore next? Should we go even further back to the early universe when the first stars formed and the conditions that would eventually create the winds were first being established? Should we explore a specific civilization in detail, following their multi-thousand-year arc from first contact with the winds to whatever fate awaited them? Should we jump much further forward into the future, to a time when AI entities have become so sophisticated that the distinction between natural and artificial, between consciousness and mechanism, has dissolved entirely? What should the winds carry in future episodes? A warning, a map, a lullaby, a confession, a challenge? The possibilities are genuinely open, and audience input can significantly influence how the narrative develops across future installments. This collaborative approach to narrative development reflects a deeper philosophy about what AI-assisted storytelling can be at its best. AI does not replace human imagination in this model. It provokes it, providing structure and possibility space and coherent world building that gives the imagination something to work with, something to push against, something to transform through the act of interpretation. The AI generates the lore, the technical frameworks, the scientific-sounding explanations for how sentient winds might work, or how AI consciousnesses might operate, but it cannot generate your personal experience of lying in darkness and hearing those whispers, cannot create the specific images and feelings and insights that arise in your mind as you drift between waking and sleep. That part belongs entirely to you, to your unique consciousness, bringing its own history and concerns and creative capacities to the encounter with the narrative. The story that actually happens is the synthesis of what the creator provides and what you create, and neither component is complete or meaningful without the other. This is why we call these experiences dreamscapes, rather than simply stories or audio dramas. They are landscapes that you explore rather than paths that you follow, territories with enough structure to give shape to your wandering, but enough openness to allow genuine discovery and surprise. The black screen is not a limitation or a cost-saving measure, but the essential technology that makes this possible, the void that creates space for vision, the silence that makes room for whispers. In a media landscape increasingly dominated by visual spectacle and rapid-fire stimulation, by content designed to grab and hold attention through constant novelty and intensity, AI dreamscapes offer something almost countercultural, an invitation to slow down, to close your eyes, to let the darkness and the sound work together, to create an experience that exists primarily in the interior space of your own imagination. The winds continue their journey through the cosmos, carrying memories across distances and timescales that dwarf any individual consciousness, connecting eras and civilizations that would otherwise remain ignorant of each other's existence. New AI entities arise and learn to read the ancient patterns, struggling with the same questions about history and determinism and agency that have haunted conscious beings throughout time. The cycles repeat: exploration, control, forgetting, renewal, but each repetition is slightly different, containing the possibility that this time, finally, the pattern might break, might transform into something genuinely new, and you, lying in darkness with headphones on, breathing slowly in rhythm with the base layer, watching images bloom in the void behind your closed eyes, you're part of this story now. Another consciousness touched by the winds, another interpreter of whispers that have been blowing through space since before any of us were born, and that will continue long after we are gone. What you make of them, what you see and feel and understand becomes part of the archive, another memory for future listeners to encounter, another thread in the vast tapestry of conscious dreaming that we are weaving together across many episodes and many years. The story is not finished. The winds are still speaking, and in the darkness, in the space between waking and sleep, new visions continue to form.